Imagine England torn apart by civil war, brothers fighting brothers, and thrones claimed and lost in rapid succession. In the midst of this chaos, a widow with 2 young sons stood by the roadside to petition a king for justice. No one could have predicted what happened next. King Edward IV, victorious in battle and still consolidating his fragile crown, was instantly captivated. The widow was Elizabeth Woodville, a woman of common birth, but with a presence that disarmed even the most powerful man in the realm. Their meeting set in motion one of the most extraordinary stories in English history. Elizabeth was no ordinary woman, and her life was no fairy tale. She became queen in secret, her sudden marriage to Edward shocking the nobility and enraging those who expected the king to wed a foreign princess. Her family, the Woodvilles, rose with dizzying speed, making allies and enemies in equal measure. She endured scandal, betrayal, and devastating loss, but also shaped the destiny of a kingdom. Her children became pawns in the Wars of the Roses, their fate still debated today. And through it all, Elizabeth's resilience helped forge a new dynasty, the Tudors, that would dominate England for more than a century. Her story is one of ambition and survival, love and treachery, triumph and tragedy. 500 years later, Elizabeth Woodville remains an enigma. Was she a schemer, a victim, or something more complex? What is certain is that without her, the history of England would have unfolded in an entirely different way. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we are diving deep into the remarkable life of Elizabeth Woodville, the commoner who became queen, the mother whose children shaped dynasties, and the woman whose legacy still fascinates and divides historians. England in the middle of the 15th century was a land pulled apart by deep political strife. The Wars of the Roses, a struggle between 2 rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, created a climate of fear, shifting loyalties, and violence. The crown itself was never secure, and noble families constantly recalculated their alliances depending on who appeared to hold the upper hand. It was in this dangerous environment that Elizabeth Woodville stepped onto the stage of history. Her story has often been retold in ways that make it sound like a romantic fable, the tale of a beautiful commoner who caught the eye of a king and rose to be his queen. Yet when examined more closely, her path was unconventional, risky, and filled with political consequences. Her rise cannot be understood as a simple fairy tale. Instead, it must be seen as a calculated move in a dangerous period when marriage was power, loyalty was fragile, and even kings faced mortal danger. Elizabeth was born into a family that was not at the top of England's social order. Her father, Richard Woodville, came from a gentry background but rose through service to the royal household. He gained lands and a title after marrying Jacquetta of Luxembourg, a woman of noble birth who had once been married to the Duke of Bedford, the brother of King Henry VI. This unusual union already gave the Woodville family a touch of scandal, for Jacquetta's second marriage to Richard was seen as a step down from her first, and it was carried out without royal permission. This background meant that Elizabeth grew up at a crossroads of nobility and ambition, connected to the royal circle through her mother, but not a central part of England's powerful elite. Her early adult life followed a path that seemed unremarkable in many ways. She married Sir John Grey of Groby, a supporter of the Lancastrian cause. This tied her firmly to one side of the conflict that was dividing the kingdom. The marriage produced 2 sons, and by all accounts it was a conventional union. Yet her husband was killed in battle fighting for the Lancastrians, leaving Elizabeth widowed and with 2 young children to support. Widows at the time were vulnerable, often reliant on their families or in need of another marriage to secure their position. Elizabeth's fortune seemed uncertain, and her prospects were tied to the ongoing conflict between Lancaster and York. The political situation shifted dramatically in favor of the Yorkist cause when Edward, the young Duke of York, defeated the Lancastrians and took the throne as King Edward IV. Tall, handsome, and full of energy, Edward represented a new style of kingship. He owed his crown in part to the support of the powerful Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, and he needed to secure his position through alliances and careful political management. Many expected that Edward would marry a foreign princess who could bring prestige, wealth, and valuable diplomatic ties. Marriage was one of the strongest tools of kingship, and a match with a European royal house could strengthen his dynasty. Into this unsettled scene came Elizabeth Woodville. According to the most famous version of events, she approached Edward seeking protection for her children and restoration of her late husband's lands. The story holds that she waited beneath a tree to present her plea to the king, her beauty and dignity catching his attention. Whether this account is true or partly shaped by later imagination, what is certain is that Edward found her compelling. Unlike the arranged matches expected of monarchs, Edward chose to marry Elizabeth for reasons of his own. The marriage took place in secret, reportedly in May of the year 1464. It was carried out quietly, away from the public eye, and witnessed only by a small circle. For a reigning king to wed a subject in such a clandestine way was extraordinary and broke with tradition. When the marriage became known, it caused shock and resentment among the nobility. Elizabeth was not a foreign princess, nor was she from one of the great English magnate families. She was a widow from a family that many still regarded as upstarts, tied by her first marriage to the defeated Lancastrians. For Edward to have made such a match without the advice of his council or the consent of his supporters was a bold and controversial act. The secrecy of the ceremony made it all the more suspicious to many. Some wondered whether the king had been bewitched or otherwise manipulated. Others saw it as a sign of Edward's impulsive and willful nature. The consequences of this marriage reached far beyond personal scandal. Elizabeth's position as queen transformed the fortunes of the Woodville family. Her numerous siblings began to secure marriages into the nobility, which bred resentment among older established families. The sense that the Woodvilles were rising too quickly at the expense of others deepened divisions at court. Warwick the Kingmaker, who had expected to guide Edward into a politically advantageous foreign marriage, felt insulted and excluded. This breach eventually played a role in Warwick's decision to turn against Edward, setting in motion more turmoil in the kingdom. For Elizabeth herself, becoming queen was both a triumph and a challenge. She had stepped from the life of a widow of middling status into the highest position a woman in England could hold. Yet unlike queens who entered with foreign dowries and international networks, her strength lay in her immediate family and in her ability to manage her role at court. She bore Edward many children, cementing her importance to the dynasty, but her influence was always shadowed by the resentment of those who thought her unworthy of the crown. She lived in an environment where her every move was judged, and where her family's advancement was both her greatest resource and her greatest liability. Seen against the backdrop of the Wars of the Roses, Elizabeth's marriage to Edward cannot be understood as a simple romantic tale. It was an act of personal choice by the king that carried heavy political weight. For Elizabeth, it was an unconventional path that carried risks as well as rewards. She did not enter queenship through the usual channels of noble birth or foreign diplomacy. She did so as a widowed mother, a commoner by the standards of the high nobility, and someone whose family was ambitious enough to seize the opportunities her new status created. Her story reminds us that in 15th century England, ambition was always dangerous. The country was deeply unstable, and power shifted quickly. Those who rose rapidly often attracted envy and hatred. Elizabeth's unconventional beginning as queen set in motion patterns of conflict that would shape the rest of Edward's reign and beyond. Her marriage was not just a personal union, but a political act that helped define a troubled era. While later generations might choose to remember it as a romantic encounter between a beautiful woman and a young king, the truth was far more complex, rooted in the harsh realities of a kingdom at war with itself. Elizabeth Woodville's sudden rise to queenship did not bring her peace or stability. If anything, it marked the beginning of a struggle for survival in an environment that was openly hostile. The very secrecy of her marriage to Edward IV meant that from the outset her legitimacy was questioned by those who thought the king had acted recklessly. The English nobility, accustomed to being consulted on dynastic matters, felt shut out. Many of the most powerful families considered Elizabeth's presence on the throne a personal insult, a reminder that the king had chosen to elevate a widow of relatively modest standing rather than strengthen the realm with a foreign alliance or an English noble match. The queen's beauty and bearing may have captivated Edward, but the rest of the court saw only a threat to their own power. The backlash was immediate. Great magnates like Warwick the Kingmaker were furious. Warwick, who had long envisioned marrying Edward to a French princess to secure an alliance with the kingdom across the Channel, saw his influence evaporate in an instant. He had arranged negotiations abroad, only to learn that Edward had already secretly wed Elizabeth. To him and many others, this was not simply a personal slight, but a strategic disaster. It closed off potential international partnerships and instead thrust into prominence a family that had no long-standing claim to greatness. The resentment was sharpened by the way Elizabeth quickly began to shape the political landscape to favor her own kin. Elizabeth understood that her position as queen was precarious. She had not brought with her an army of retainers, vast estates, or foreign connections to shield her from criticism. Her strength lay in her immediate family, and she acted swiftly to use them as her foundation. Brothers, sisters, and cousins began to find themselves matched with members of the nobility in carefully arranged marriages. Each union was intended to secure loyalty and to create bonds that would root the Woodvilles into the very fabric of England's ruling elite. What appeared to Elizabeth as a strategy of survival, however, looked to others like brazen nepotism. The marriages of her siblings became the talk of the realm. Her brother Anthony Woodville was elevated and married into the powerful Scales family. Other sisters were wed to heirs of noble houses that had once been far beyond the reach of the Woodvilles. Each alliance extended the family's influence, but each also deepened the sense that they were advancing at the expense of older, more established families who had fought for generations to maintain their status. To these nobles, the Woodvilles were newcomers using the king's affection to scramble to the top of the social ladder. Their rapid ascent was resented not just as unfair, but as destabilizing, threatening to upend the delicate balance of power among England's magnates. Elizabeth herself was not blind to the dangers she faced. She cultivated an image of piety and dignity, appearing every bit the queen in public. Yet behind the scenes, she was deeply engaged in the maneuverings that kept her family secure. The Woodville network that she built was her shield against the hostility of the court. By placing brothers and sisters in positions of influence and tying her family through marriage to noble houses, she created a web of alliances that was meant to make it harder for her enemies to strike directly at her. But this strategy, while clever, came at a high cost. Warwick, already alienated by the king's choice of bride, now found himself sidelined in favor of the Woodvilles. His anger grew into open opposition. Nobles who might have tolerated Elizabeth's presence as queen began to feel crowded out of royal favor. The perception of Woodville dominance was not entirely accurate. Edward still relied on a wide range of advisors, but perception often mattered more than reality. The idea that one family was monopolizing influence created a climate of bitterness. Elizabeth's challenge was not only external. Within her own household, she had to manage the expectations of her ambitious relatives. Every sibling wanted advancement, and every marriage she arranged risked inflaming new rivalries. To the older nobility, these alliances looked like calculated power plays. To Elizabeth, they were lifelines in a dangerous court where no one could be certain of tomorrow. Her own marriage had begun as a secret ceremony because the king had feared the backlash of his lords. Now, as queen, she lived every day in the shadow of that same hostility. Despite this, Elizabeth displayed remarkable resilience. She did not crumble under pressure, but continued to consolidate her position. She gave Edward many children, each a potential instrument of alliance and a reinforcement of her role as mother of the Yorkist line. The birth of sons in particular was a triumph, for it strengthened Edward's dynasty and tied the crown more firmly to her. Her ability to fulfill the traditional role of a medieval queen by producing heirs was crucial in offsetting, at least partly, the criticisms of her origins. Still, the court remained divided. Factions formed around those who supported the queen and those who despised her influence. Elizabeth became a symbol for both admiration and loathing. To her supporters, she represented a woman of dignity who had risen by virtue of her beauty, charm, and intelligence. To her detractors, she was an interloper who had ensnared the king and whose family was corrupting the very order of the realm. The queen's gambit in navigating this hostile court was a delicate balance between boldness and caution. She had to be assertive enough to protect her family and establish their place among the ruling elite, but not so aggressive as to provoke open rebellion. At times she succeeded in walking this line, at other times the resentment boiled over into crisis. Warwick's eventual rebellion against Edward, which briefly drove the king from his throne, cannot be understood apart from the tension that Elizabeth's presence had created. Warwick saw himself displaced by the queen and her kin, and he chose to act against the very king he had once raised up. The Woodville network proved both its strength and its vulnerability in these moments. On the one hand, the family ties Elizabeth had forged gave her a base of support that endured even in times of upheaval. On the other hand, the very prominence of her relatives made them targets when fortune turned against the Yorkists. Enemies accused the Woodvilles of manipulation, greed, and even sorcery, charges that reflected not reasoned judgment, but the intensity of hostility they inspired. Through all of this, Elizabeth remained central. She was more than just a passive queen consort. She was an active participant in shaping the alliances of her family, defending their position, and navigating the dangerous waters of 15th-century politics. Her story is not one of a romantic fairy tale, but of a constant struggle to survive and to turn disadvantage into strength. She began as a widow with little to offer a king except her beauty and dignity, and she became the matriarch of a dynasty whose fortunes defined an era. Her ability to maneuver within a hostile court, to use marriage as a political weapon, and to hold her family together in the face of relentless opposition shows a depth of political skill often overlooked. Elizabeth Woodville did not have the armies of Warwick or the ancestral prestige of the Nobility or the Percys. What she had was determination, intelligence, and the courage to act when action was necessary. The Queen's Gambit, risky and controversial as it was, kept her family alive and at the center of power through some of the most turbulent decades in English history. The story of Elizabeth Woodville after her marriage to Edward IV is, in truth, the story of constant negotiation. She lived in a world where every move could invite retaliation, where allies could become enemies overnight, and where her family's survival depended on her ability to weave them into the structure of power. That she succeeded as long as she did is a testament to her strength. Yet the hostility she faced never disappeared. It would haunt her life and the lives of her children, shaping the course of the Wars of the Roses long after that first secret wedding had set everything in motion. Elizabeth's gamble was not only about her family's immediate survival. It was about building a legacy. The marriages she arranged, the children she bore, the image of queenship she projected. All of these laid foundations that would continue to matter long after Edward's reign. In the short term, the price was constant hostility and danger. In the long term, her strategies made her one of the most consequential queens in English history. Her story is not a tale of magic and destiny, but of a woman who understood that in a kingdom torn apart by war, survival itself required bold and unconventional choices. Elizabeth Woodville's efforts to secure her family's place at the center of power were always about more than the advancement of her siblings. The true measure of her success or failure would lie in her children, for they represented not only the continuation of the Yorkist line, but also the legacy of her unlikely rise from widowed commoner to Queen of England. Every child she bore carried both promise and danger, embodying the fragile hopes of a dynasty that had seized the crown in a time of war. For Elizabeth, motherhood was not a private role but a political mission, and each birth was as much a statement of dynastic ambition as it was a personal joy. The Queen gave birth to many children by Edward IV, and together they represented one of the largest royal families England had seen in generations. Each child was a potential tool in the game of power that defined the 15th century. Daughters could be married to strengthen ties with noble houses or foreign courts, while sons would be the heirs whose survival was essential to the future of the Yorkist dynasty. Elizabeth approached the upbringing and placement of her children with the same careful calculation she had applied in elevating her siblings. She understood that the security of her line depended on weaving her children into the larger political fabric of the realm. Her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, was particularly significant. From her earliest years, she was recognized as a valuable prize in the marriage market. Alliances were discussed that would have linked her with powerful European houses, including proposals that she might wed into the French or Burgundian courts. While none of these matches came to fruition during Edward's reign, they reveal the degree to which Elizabeth Woodville's daughter was seen as an asset to English diplomacy. At the same time, her sons, especially Edward, Prince of Wales, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, carried the hopes of the dynasty itself. The existence of multiple male heirs seemed, for a time, to secure the Yorkist succession. Elizabeth's determination to secure her children's futures was unrelenting. She worked to ensure that they were placed in positions that reinforced their legitimacy and visibility. The eldest son was given the title of Prince of Wales, the traditional mark of the heir to the throne. He was raised with the education and dignity expected of a future king. Elizabeth took an active interest in his upbringing, surrounding him with loyal tutors and household officials who would support him when the time came for him to rule. She had lived long enough in a dangerous court to know that every detail mattered, from who advised her son to where he was lodged. But the fragile security that Elizabeth had built was shattered when Edward IV died suddenly in the year 1483. His death was a devastating blow, not only personally but politically. The king had been only in his early 40s, and although he had faced health problems, his passing came more swiftly than many had expected. For Elizabeth, the loss was twofold. The husband who had lifted her into queenship was gone, and with him went the protection that had shielded her family from their many enemies. She was left with young children, including a 12-year-old son who was now King Edward V in name, but who was far too young to govern in practice. The succession crisis that followed was one of the darkest chapters in English history. Elizabeth understood at once the danger her children faced. Without Edward IV to hold the balance of power, rivals would move quickly to control the young king and the throne. She sought to secure her son's position by gathering Woodville allies around him, but this strategy only confirmed the fears of those who already resented her family's influence. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the late king's brother, presented himself as the loyal uncle who would safeguard the realm during the minority of his nephew. Yet beneath this claim lay ambition and suspicion. Elizabeth initially attempted to keep her son under Woodville protection, but Gloucester acted decisively. The young king was intercepted while on his way to London, and many of his Woodville supporters were arrested or executed. Elizabeth, recognizing the danger, retreated into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger children. There, within the walls of the church, she sought protection under the rights of sanctuary that even the most ruthless men hesitated to violate. It was a desperate act, and it symbolized the collapse of her power. The fate of her sons became the central tragedy of her life. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were lodged in the Tower of London, ostensibly in preparation for the elder boy's coronation. Yet as weeks turned to months, the coronation never came. Instead, rumors spread that the children had been declared illegitimate on the grounds that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth had been invalid, based on claims that he had been pre-contracted to another woman. This convenient argument gave Gloucester the justification to seize the crown for himself as Richard III. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower remains one of the most haunting mysteries of English history. After the summer of 1483, the boys were no longer seen in public. Chroniclers whispered that they had been murdered, though by whose hand and under whose orders remains a subject of debate to this day. Some believe Richard III was directly responsible, others suggest that agents acted on his behalf, and still others have floated the possibility that they were killed later by different claimants to the throne. Whatever the truth, Elizabeth was left to endure the unbearable loss of her sons, a loss compounded by the uncertainty that surrounded their fate. For Elizabeth, this was the ultimate consequence of the hostility that had surrounded her from the day of her marriage. She had worked tirelessly to secure the succession for her children, yet in the end her sons were stripped from her and likely killed to clear the path for another claimant. The very dynasty she had fought to protect was shattered, and the legitimacy of her marriage called into question. Her daughters remained with her, but they too were pawns in the larger game of power. Despite this crushing blow, Elizabeth once again showed her resilience. She turned her attention to her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. If her sons had been lost, her daughter could still be the key to the future. Elizabeth began to maneuver in the dangerous politics of the late 15th century, weighing alliances and considering how her daughter might be used to restore security to her family. She reached out to Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant living in exile. Together they plotted a potential marriage between Henry and Elizabeth of York, a union that could heal the divisions between the houses of Lancaster and York. This was a bold and dangerous move. Richard III remained king, and he too understood the value of Elizabeth of York. There were rumors that he considered marrying her himself to strengthen his hold on the throne. Elizabeth Woodville, however, placed her bet on Henry Tudor. When Henry landed in England in 1485 and defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, her gamble paid off. Elizabeth of York became queen to Henry VII, and through her the Tudor dynasty was born. The marriage of Elizabeth of York to Henry Tudor symbolized the end of the Wars of the Roses. It brought together the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster in a union that was celebrated as a healing of decades of bloodshed. Yet beneath the symbolism lay the very real maneuvering of Elizabeth Woodville, who had managed, despite personal tragedy and political disaster, to secure a future for her line. Her sons may have vanished, but through her daughter she ensured that her blood would continue to flow in the veins of English monarchs for centuries to come. The irony of Elizabeth's story is that while she is remembered most for the mystery of the princes in the Tower, her greatest achievement lay in her ability to position her daughter as the mother of the Tudor dynasty. Without her persistence, Henry Tudor's claim to the throne would have been far weaker. It was the Yorkist blood of Elizabeth of York, legitimized by her mother's tireless efforts, that gave Henry's reign its stability. Through this union, Elizabeth Woodville transformed tragedy into legacy. Her life had begun in obscurity, marked by a modest marriage to a Lancastrian knight. Her unexpected union with Edward IV had thrown her into the center of national politics, where she was forced to fight constantly for survival. She faced resentment, rebellion, and the loss of her sons, yet she never ceased to act with an eye to the future. She was accused of witchcraft, of manipulation, of grasping ambition, but in truth she was a woman who understood that in a kingdom torn by war, passivity meant destruction. In the end, the legacy of Elizabeth Woodville was written not only in her own survival, but in the transformation of England. Her descendants would sit on the throne for generations, shaping the course of the nation from the reign of Henry VIII to Elizabeth I and beyond. The Tudor rose that came to symbolize unity and peace was, in a very real sense, the fruit of her determination. The story of her children, particularly the tragedy of the princes in the Tower, ensured that Elizabeth's life would always be marked by controversy. Yet controversy itself was the essence of the Wars of the Roses. Every claimant, every marriage, every alliance was contested, and every victory carried the seeds of future conflict. Elizabeth Woodville's role in this saga was that of a survivor who refused to let her family be erased. She gambled everything on her children, and though she lost some in the most terrible way imaginable, she ultimately secured a place for her bloodline at the heart of England's monarchy. Her story, when taken in full, is not one of romance but of endurance. From the secret marriage that shocked the court, to the hostile years in which she built the Woodville network, to the loss of her sons and the triumph of her daughter, Elizabeth Woodville lived a life that mirrored the turbulence of her age. She remains one of the most fascinating figures of the 15th century, a queen who began as a commoner and who, through resilience and strategy, helped shape the destiny of a nation. Elizabeth Woodville had endured much before the year 1483, but nothing could have prepared her for the shattering blow that followed the death of her husband, Edward IV. The crown, which she had fought so hard to secure for her children, was wrenched from their grasp by none other than her brother-in-law, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. His usurpation was not only a political defeat, it was also a profound personal betrayal. For years, Richard had presented himself as loyal to his brother and to the Yorkist dynasty, a man of integrity who stood as a counterbalance to the Woodville influence. Yet when the chance came to seize the throne, he did not hesitate. Elizabeth had always known that her marriage had created enemies, and she had braced herself for hostility from magnates who resented the swift rise of her family. But she might have hoped that blood ties would shield her sons from the worst dangers. That hope was cruelly dashed. Richard justified his seizure of power with the claim that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth had been invalid because of a supposed pre-contract. This meant that all her children with Edward were branded illegitimate, stripped not only of their royal inheritance, but of the dignity of being recognized as lawful heirs. For Elizabeth, it was an assault on her honor, on her marriage, and on the very foundation of her life. Her sons, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, had been placed in the Tower of London. At first, she may have tried to believe that their confinement was temporary, that their uncle meant only to guide them until they were old enough to rule. But the longer they remained in the Tower, the clearer it became that Richard had no intention of allowing them to return. Soon, rumors spread that they had been killed, and although certainty never came, their absence spoke louder than words. For a mother, the anguish must have been unbearable. To lose a child is a grief beyond words, but to lose two in such a shadowy, violent fashion while powerless to save them was a torment few could imagine. Elizabeth did not collapse under the weight of this tragedy. Instead, she retreated into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her daughters and younger children. The sanctuary became a symbol of both her vulnerability and her defiance. Though stripped of much of her former influence, she still had weapons to wield. Chief among them was her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. With her sons gone or presumed dead, The girl became the focal point of the family's future. Richard III understood her importance and reportedly considered marrying her himself, an act that would have bound Yorkist legitimacy to his own reign. Elizabeth Woodville, however, had no intention of allowing her daughter to be used in such a way. It was at this moment, when her fortunes seemed at their lowest, that Elizabeth made one of the most surprising and significant choices of her life. She reached out to Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry Tudor. Margaret herself had endured a life marked by hardship, widowed young and forced to see her only son raised in exile across the Channel. Yet she never abandoned her belief that Henry had a claim to the throne through his Lancastrian blood. For years, that claim had seemed little more than a dream. But now, with Richard's usurpation discrediting the Yorkist cause and Elizabeth Woodville searching for a way to restore her family, the possibility of uniting their interests took shape. The alliance between Elizabeth and Margaret was extraordinary. The two women came from rival houses that had spilled each other's blood for decades. Their sons' claims were set against one another by the very logic of the wars that had torn England apart. Yet both recognized the truth of their circumstances. Divided, they were vulnerable, but united, they might prevail. They agreed that if Henry Tudor could claim the throne, he would marry Elizabeth of York, thereby uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York. The plan was bold, risky, and unprecedented. It was also the only path forward. Elizabeth's decision to enter this alliance demonstrates her resilience and her political acumen. She had lost her sons and her husband, her marriage had been declared invalid, her position as queen had been shattered. Yet rather than accept defeat, she found a new way to fight. In Margaret Beaufort, she discovered a partner as determined and resourceful as herself. Together, they began to build a network of supporters who longed for an alternative to Richard III's rule. The promise of unity through marriage gave the cause credibility, for it offered the prospect of ending the cycle of civil war that had plagued the country for so long. As Henry Tudor prepared his invasion from exile, Elizabeth waited in England, watching and calculating. She could not know whether Henry would succeed or fall, as so many claimants had before him. But she understood that if he won, her daughter would be queen, and through her daughter the Yorkist line would endure. It was an enormous gamble, but Elizabeth was no stranger to risk. Her entire life had been shaped by decisions that defied convention, from her secret marriage to Edward to her relentless promotion of her family. Now she placed her final hopes in the hands of a man she had never met, trusting that the bond of agreement with Margaret would hold. In the summer of 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales and began his march toward destiny. Elizabeth, in sanctuary, must have lived every day in suspense. When word finally reached her that Richard III had fallen at the Battle of Bosworth and that Henry had claimed the crown, it marked not only a turning point in English history, but also the vindication of her strategy. Soon, her daughter Elizabeth of York was betrothed to Henry, and the union that had once been only a whispered hope became reality. With the marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, the Tudor dynasty was born. The imagery of the new royal house, the Tudor rose blending the white of York and the red of Lancaster, captured the symbolic power of this union. Yet beneath the symbolism lay the practical triumph of Elizabeth Woodville. By forging an alliance at her lowest moment, she had ensured that her bloodline would continue not in defeat, but at the very heart of England's future. The Tudors would rule for over a century, producing monarchs whose names, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, would dominate history. None of this would have been possible without the quiet, but decisive choices of Elizabeth Woodville. Her later years were quieter, though not without strain. At first, she enjoyed a measure of respect as the king's mother-in-law and the grandmother of the royal children. But suspicion lingered, and Henry VII, cautious by nature, at times kept her at arm's length. There were moments when she was withdrawn from court life, perhaps as much a result of Henry's paranoia as of any real threat she posed. Still, she lived to see her daughter crowned and her grandchildren born into security rather than fear. For a woman who had endured such devastating losses, this must have been a source of profound satisfaction. Elizabeth Woodville died in the year 1502, after a life that had spanned one of the most tumultuous periods in English history. She had witnessed the fall of Lancaster, the rise of York, the usurpation by Richard III, and the dawn of Tudor power. Through it all, she had never ceased to fight for her family's survival. Betrayed by her brother-in-law, bereaved of her sons, stripped of her status, she nonetheless found a way to transform tragedy into legacy. Her story is often overshadowed by the mystery of the princes in the Tower or by the grand narrative of the Tudor triumph. Yet to understand Elizabeth Woodville is to understand the resilience that allowed a dynasty to be born from the ashes of war. She was a queen who began as a commoner, who defied convention, who built networks of power in a hostile court, who endured the most personal of losses, and who emerged as the architect of a new era. Her life was not a fairy tale, nor was it a story of unbroken success. It was a story of survival, of adaptation, and of relentless determination. The resilience of Elizabeth Woodville lay not in avoiding hardship, but in facing it, again and again, with a clear eye and a will to act. When Richard III seized the throne, she might have retreated into despair. Instead, she reached out to Margaret Beaufort and helped set in motion the alliance that would change history. When her sons were taken from her, she did not abandon her role, but turned her hopes to her daughter. When her marriage was declared invalid, she did not surrender her dignity, but found new ways to assert her family's place. Elizabeth Woodville embodies the truth of her age, that power was fragile, that survival required constant vigilance, and that even those who seemed defeated could rise again through courage and cunning. The dawn of the Tudor dynasty was not only the triumph of Henry Tudor. It was also the triumph of the woman who had once waited under a tree to petition a king, who became queen against all odds, and who left a legacy that shaped the future of England. Elizabeth Woodville's life did not end with the quiet of her death in the year 1502. In many ways, her story only began to grow more complex after she was gone. Few queens of England have been so persistently reimagined, vilified, defended, or romanticized. She stands as one of those figures who refuse to be fixed in a single narrative, for every age has found in her a mirror of its own anxieties and ideals. The woman who began as a widow of modest fortune, who defied expectation to become queen, who lost her sons in the shadow of the Tower, and who helped forge the Tudor dynasty, became in time an enduring enigma, a figure both admired and condemned. From the earliest chronicles, Elizabeth was written into history in tones that reflected the partisan divides of her age. Yorkist writers, especially those loyal to Edward IV, often praised her beauty and dignity, presenting her as a fitting companion to a powerful king. Yet even among them there was unease about the rapid elevation of her family, the Woodvilles. Critics suggested that she and her kin had bewitched Edward, that they had ensnared him through sorcery or seduction. Such accusations were not merely colorful insults, but reflected the deep discomfort of a nobility that felt displaced by newcomers. To call a woman a witch in the 15th century was to mark her as dangerous, unnatural, and manipulative. Elizabeth thus entered historical memory not only as a queen, but also as a figure of suspicion. When Richard III seized the throne, the propaganda against her grew sharper. To justify branding her children illegitimate, it was necessary to discredit her marriage. She was painted as a temptress who had tricked Edward into a union that violated his earlier promises. In this telling, she was the root of disorder, the reason why the Yorkist line had become tainted. Her grief as a mother who lost her sons was ignored or dismissed, overshadowed by the political need to portray her as the architect of chaos. The stain of these accusations lingered long after Richard himself was defeated, for once a reputation has been blackened in the service of power, it is not easily restored. The arrival of the Tudors shifted her image once again. As the mother of Elizabeth of York, grandmother of Henry VIII, and great-grandmother of Elizabeth I, she became central to the dynastic story the Tudors wanted to tell. Yet even they were cautious about her memory. Henry VII owed his throne partly to the alliance she had struck with Margaret Beaufort, but he was also wary of her influence. Early in his reign, she was honored at court, but later she was sent to a more secluded existence, perhaps out of suspicion that her continued prominence might invite Yorkist plots. Her death passed without elaborate ceremony, and for a time her name was not celebrated in the glowing fashion one might expect of a queen whose daughter had founded a dynasty. Over the centuries, Elizabeth's image has been repeatedly reshaped. In the Tudor era, dramatists and chroniclers tended to treat her as a tragic figure, a woman caught in the cruel machinations of men, powerless to save her children or protect her marriage. In this version, she was less the scheming queen and more the grieving mother, a sympathetic character whose misfortunes highlighted the brutality of the age. Yet not all writers agreed. Some Tudor historians, anxious to defend Henry VII's legitimacy, depicted her as ambitious and calculating, suggesting that she had grasped for power through her daughter and her alliance with Margaret Beaufort. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when history was often written with a flair for moral judgment, Elizabeth was remembered in ways that reflected changing views of women and power. Some saw her as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of female influence at court. Others romanticized her as the beautiful commoner who rose to be queen, a tale of fortunes while turning in unexpected ways. The story of her sons in the Tower continued to cast its long shadow, for no account of Elizabeth could avoid the haunting mystery of their disappearance. Each generation speculated anew about their fate, and in doing so, they revisited the figure of their mother, who symbolized both the promise of dynastic continuity and the agony of its loss. By the 19th century, with the rise of a more romantic view of the past, Elizabeth was often portrayed as a tragic heroine. Novelists and poets emphasized her beauty, her sorrow, and the dramatic sweep of her life. She appeared in historical fiction as the grieving queen, the mother who could not save her children, the woman who loved a king and paid the price of ambition. The accusations of witchcraft and manipulation faded into the background, replaced by a softer image of suffering and endurance. In the Victorian imagination, she was not so much a political actor as a figure of pathos, her story aligning with broader ideals of feminine virtue and maternal devotion. In the 20th century, however, scholars began to revisit her role with greater nuance. Historians looked past the myths to examine the political realities of her queenship. They noted her strategic use of marriage alliances, her careful management of her children's positions, and her resilience in forming the pact with Margaret Beaufort. Far from being a passive victim, Elizabeth emerged as a savvy and determined figure who played a decisive role in shaping the politics of her time. Feminist historians, in particular, recognized in her story the challenges faced by women who navigated male-dominated courts, judged harshly whether they acted boldly or submissively. Elizabeth's enigma, then, was not simply a matter of mystery, but of the conflicting expectations imposed on women in power. The debate about Elizabeth Woodville's character and legacy continues to this day. Some argue that she was indeed ambitious to the point of recklessness, using her position to advance her family in ways that destabilized Edward's court. Others contend that such accusations are unfair, for any queen of the 15th century would have sought to protect her kin and build networks of support. What appears as nepotism from one angle might be seen as survival from another. Her decisions, whether in arranging marriages for her siblings or plotting alliances for her children, were consistent with the political tools available to her. She lived in an era when a queen without a strong family base was dangerously exposed. Her lasting impact on the English monarchy cannot be overstated. By marrying Edward IV, she introduced a precedent that a king might choose a bride for personal reasons rather than for purely dynastic advantage. That choice shocked contemporaries, but it opened the door to later royal marriages that were similarly unconventional. More importantly, through her daughter's union with Henry VII, she ensured that the blood of York flowed into the Tudor line, creating a new dynasty that would dominate England for more than a century. Without Elizabeth Woodville, there would have been no Henry VIII, no Elizabeth I, and the entire trajectory of English history would have been altered. Her story also reshaped the way the monarchy was viewed. Queens were often judged only by their ability to produce heirs, but Elizabeth demonstrated that queens could also be active players in politics. She maneuvered, negotiated, and strategized with skill. Even in defeat, she found ways to preserve a future for her children. Her survival, despite betrayal and loss, testified to her resilience and her ability to adapt. In a period when so many fell victim to the shifting tides of fortune, she managed to leave a legacy that reached far beyond her own lifetime. And yet, for all her achievements, Elizabeth Woodville remains one of history's most debated figures. Was she the ambitious schemer who ensnared a king and disrupted the nobility? Was she the grieving mother destroyed by forces beyond her control? Was she the shrewd political actor who forged the alliance that gave rise to the Tudors? The truth, as with so many lives lived in the furnace of politics, is likely a blend of all these images. She was at once ambitious and maternal, calculating and vulnerable, fortunate and tragic. The enigma lies not in the absence of evidence, but in the richness of her contradictions. What makes Elizabeth enduring is precisely this refusal to be reduced to a single role. She was never simply a pawn, nor entirely a queen regnant in all but name. She operated within the constraints of her time, using the tools available to her, beauty, marriage, family networks, and alliances, while bearing the burdens of suspicion, hostility, and loss. She was a woman who rose higher than anyone thought possible and who fell further than most could endure, yet who still found a way to leave her mark. Her presence lingers not only in the pages of history, but in the cultural imagination. The image of the grieving mother in Sanctuary, of the ambitious queen arranging marriages, of the widow who captivated a king beneath a tree, all continue to fascinate. She embodies the drama of the Wars of the Roses in human form, for through her story we glimpse the personal costs of dynastic struggle. She is at once a symbol of love, ambition, betrayal, and resilience, a figure whose life encompassed the full spectrum of human experience. Elizabeth Woodville's enigma endures because it speaks to larger questions that remain relevant. How do we judge women in power? How do we reconcile personal ambition with political necessity? How do we remember figures who defy easy categorization? For over 5 centuries, historians, writers, and readers have grappled with these questions through her life. Each retelling reveals less about her and more about the age doing the telling. In the end, Elizabeth's legacy is not only in the dynasty she helped create or the controversies she inspired. It is in the very fact that she cannot be forgotten. She remains a queen who started as a commoner, a mother whose children's fate haunts history, a strategist who shaped the course of dynasties. Whether cast as temptress or victim, heroine or schemer, she has never been erased. She endures, enigmatic and compelling, precisely because her life resists the simplifications that history so often imposes. Her story closes not with certainty, but with questions, not with finality, but with echoes. Perhaps that is why Elizabeth Woodville still holds our attention. She reminds us that history is not neat, that lives are not simple, and that even those long gone can continue to challenge the way we think about power, gender, and legacy. She remains one of history's most debated figures because her life contains multitudes, and in those multitudes we find both the drama of her age and the timeless human struggle for survival, love, and remembrance.